In the 4th century BC, a curious Greek man traveled the entire ancient world. He wasn't a warrior or a king. He was something even rarer in the ancient world, a storyteller. He traveled for 8 years, visiting the world's most important cities, experiencing countless adventures along the way. His name was Herodotus, and in this video, we're going to be exploring the stories and writings from his travels in ancient Greece, the Persian Empire, ancient Egypt, Babylon, Ethiopia, India, Arabia, Scythia, and Libya. His travels began in ancient Egypt, where he writes about visiting the pyramids of Giza and the translated conversations he had with ancient Egyptian priests describing the construction of the magnificent ancient wonder. After his travels, Herodotus composed all of his writings into one extraordinary book, the Histories, one of mankind's greatest literary achievements not lost to translation or time. Presenting it to the Athenian assembly, its greatness was immediately recognized. For his efforts, Herodotus was awarded 250 kilograms of gold. But long before he'd be known as the father of history, Herodotus was just a curious young boy, born in the Greek city of Halicarnassus. Herodotus was born in 484 BC to a wealthy, educated family at a time when Halicarnassus was under Persian rule and occupation. Now, Herodotus could have chosen a docile life. He was rich and educated at a time when luck was in very short supply. He was born at a time when the Greco-Persian War was at its fever pitch. When he was just 5 years old, his people defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea in a decisive victory. Herodotus wanted to know why. Why was there so much conflict between the Greeks and non-Greek? Could he, Herodotus, trace these wars to their very beginning? And could he do that from the comfort of his hometown, Halicarnassus? Of course not. So, Herodotus stepped out, away from Halicarnassus and into the world. First to Susa, then to Babylon. Why is there so much conflict between the Greeks and non-Greeks? When Herodotus journeyed to Susa, the winter capital of the Achaemenid Empire, he met Persians there and asked them this question. In response, they traced the conflict back to the Phoenicians, to a time before the Trojan War. According to the Persians, the Phoenicians came to Argos, a precursor to ancient Greece, for trade. But in the process, they kidnapped Io, the king's daughter. They took Io and sailed to Egypt. This, according to them, was the original sin. So at a later time, the Greeks returned the favor by landing in Tyre on the Phoenician coast and kidnapping Europa, the daughter of the Phoenician king. This was an act of retaliation. Now you could say they were level. But the Greeks would commit another act of revenge when they manned a warship, sailed to Colchis, and kidnapped Medea, the daughter of the king of the land. Colchis was not Phoenician, but they were non-Greek, and that was all that mattered. So when the king of the land sent a messenger to Greece demanding both the return of his daughter and reparations for the wrong done to him and his people, the Greeks basically told him to leave while reminding him of the original crime the Phoenicians had committed. According to the Persians, the tally stood 2-1 in favor of the Greek. It was unfair, but it would take another generation for the non-Greeks to level the scoreline. Their revenge came from Paris, son of Priam, when he stole Helen from Greece. The Greeks were furious, and they asked for reparations and Helen back. But Paris reminded them of the incident with Medea and asked them if it would be fair to return Helen when they refused the offer from a generation before. After this, the Greek raised a mighty army that sparked the Trojan War, killed Priam, his son Paris, and destroyed the city. This, the Persians said, was the reason why they regarded the Greeks as enemies. This was the root cause of the war. Now, if this were any other historian, the story would end here. But Herodotus set himself apart from other historians of his time and before by always asking why. This is how Herodotus discovered that the Phoenicians did not agree with the Persians' version of events. In fact, the Phoenicians believed that the women they supposedly kidnapped came willingly. To them, the original sin with Io wasn't a sin because she had slept with their captain, gotten pregnant, and eloped with them so the whole affair wouldn't be discovered at home. But even this account wasn't enough for Herodotus. He wasn't convinced, so he proposed an alternate theory set in a time more recent to his. It was another explanation for the root cause of the hostilities. According to Herodotus, Croesus, king of Lydia, was the first non-Greek to encroach on Greek freedom. Croesus was the last king of the Mernad dynasty, the ruler of the ancient kingdom of Lydia from 585 BC to 546 BC. At the peak of his reign, he was considered by many to be the richest man on earth. But before Herodotus told the story of Croesus, he spoke of a predecessor, a king named Canalus, whose reign preceded Croesus by generations, and whose downfall was directly connected to Croesus's eventual downfall. Canalus reigned over the kingdom of Lydia more than 100 years before Croesus, and he was the last king of the Heraclid dynasty. Canalus had a guard named Gyges, whom he loved and trusted so much that he discussed everything with him, including deeply sensitive matters. But the love of a king is like fire. Enough of it will keep you warm, too much of it, and you'll find yourself consumed by its flames. Gyges found himself in front of those flames when Canalus insisted on proving to Gyges how beautiful his wife, the queen, was. And by proof, Canalus meant he wanted Gyges to watch the queen naked. This was an abomination by any stretch of the imagination, and as Herodotus pointed out, in Lydia, in fact, more or less throughout the non-Greek world, it is a source of great shame even for a man to be seen naked. So it was no surprise that Gyges was against this. He wanted none of it. In fact, he begged the king not to make him do it. But Canalus was his king, and kings get what kings want. However, Canalus assured Gyges that no harm would come to him for seeing the queen's nudity. So at night, when the queen was undressing before her king in their bedroom, Gyges watched from a hidden spot. Unfortunately for him, the queen noticed. The very next morning, she summoned Gyges and gave him two options. Either you can kill Canalus and have me and the kingdom of Lydia for your own, or you must kill yourself right now. Either the one whose idea this was, or the one who saw me naked when he had no right to do so. Caught between the devil and the deep sea, Gyges, like he had before, chose the devil. He chose himself. He chose to live. Gyges killed Canalus and had the queen and kingdom of Lydia all to himself, ending the Heraclid dynasty and installing his Mernad dynasty. But in these stories told to Herodotus, actions have consequences. And for Gyges, even though we could argue it wasn't his fault for the circumstances that made him king, the Oracle of Delphi declared that Canalus would have his revenge on the fourth generation of Gyges. Despite this ominous prophecy, Gyges began to conquer cities, and in his conquests, the Greek cities of Miletus, Smyrna, and Colophon came under his rule. After Gyges, his son Artus took over, continuing in the conquests of his father, and like his father, not achieving much. After Artus, his son Sidiotes took the throne, ruling shortly and even less noteworthy than his father. It was Auletes, son of Sidiotes, that would build the foundation for the baffling empire his son, Croesus, would wreck on their end of the world. Croesus, the man whom Herodotus pointed to as the non-Greek responsible for the first serious assault on the Greeks. Immediately after he took the throne, Herodotus says Croesus attacked the Ephesians. They were the first Greek state to suffer his wrath. After the Ephesians, Croesus attacked and subdued all of the Ionian and Aeolian cities one by one, and he made them pay tribute to him. After this, he built ships with the plan to attack the Aegean islands. Fortunately for the Ionian Greeks living on those islands, Croesus abandoned this plan and focused instead on building alliances with them. The result of these conquests was a wealth beyond the imagination of any man living at that point in history. Sardis, the capital of the Lydian Empire, became the epicenter of that world, and it was visited by every learned Greek who was alive at the time. Everyone knew one thing for a fact: Croesus, king of the Lydian Empire, was the richest man in the known world. Of this, there was no question. But there was another question that plagued Croesus's mind at the time. It was not enough to be the richest, he wanted to be the happiest. There are very few men wiser than Solon amongst all the Greek men in Lydia, and amongst those that visited Croesus' court, none were as wise. Solon was a native of Athens, who was skilled enough to draw up laws for the people of his city, and wise enough to include a 10-year clause that stopped the Athenians from revising the laws he made. The Athenians were notoriously dependent on his services, and the true reason for this clause was so he would not be disturbed by them for a decade while he traveled. During his time in Sardis, he visited one of Croesus's banquets, and the king asked him the question, "Who is the happiest of all men?" Solon knew Croesus expected to be flattered. Solon knew the king expected him to utter his name. So Solon told him what he really felt. "My lord, Tellus of Athens." Croesus was surprised, more curious than he was pissed, so he asked Solon, "What makes you think Tellus is the happiest man?" Solon responded by giving him 2 reasons why Tellus was happiest of all men. In the first place, while living in a prosperous state, Tellus had sons who were fine, upstanding men, and he lived to see them all have children, all of whom survived. In the second place, his death came at a time when he had a good income, by our standards, and it was a glorious death. You see, in a battle at Eleusis between Athens and her neighbors, he stepped into the breach and made the enemy turn tail and flee. He died, but his death was splendid, and the Athenians awarded him a public funeral on the spot where he fell, and greatly honored him. Croesus was impressed by this answer and accepted it, but he missed the message Solon was trying to pass across, because his next question to Solon was, "Who is the second happiest person of all men?" Again, knowing that Croesus was expecting to hear his name, Solon replied instead with 2 names. Twin brothers from Argos named Cleovis and Biton. These Argive twins were blessed with amazing physical strength and were rich. One day during a festival of Hera at Argos, their mother urgently needed to be taken to the sanctuary on her cart, but the oxen was missing. So the brothers strapped themselves to the yoke and pulled the cart with their mother riding on it. The distance to the temple was 4 miles. When they arrived, the people of Argos praised the twins, and they praised their mother even more for being lucky to birth such noble men. Overcome with joy, their mother prayed to her goddess. She prayed that in return for the great honor her children Cleovis and Biton had brought her, the goddess should give them whatever was best for a human being to have. That very night, her sons died, and the Argives built a statue to their name. Croesus was far from pleased with this answer. He was certain that Solon was messing with him, but Solon explained in plain terms that no man alive could be called the happiest man until he had died. Solon acknowledged that Croesus was wealthy and happy now, but he went on to explain that, unless good fortune attends him and sees to it that, when he dies well and with all his advantages intact, Croesus cannot be truly called the happiest man. Croesus wasn't convinced. He hated Solon, but Croesus didn't need to be convinced. He would learn Solon's lesson very quickly. After Solon left, Croesus had a dream. In that dream, he saw one of his sons dying from a wound caused by an iron spearhead. Now, Croesus had 2 sons. One was deaf and dumb, and the other, Otis, was one of the most outstanding men of his generation, a commander of his father's army and the heir to his throne. Croesus had divined for a cure from the Oracle of Delphi about his deaf-mute son. But the response he got from the Oracle was, "Croesus of Lydia, ruler of many, you are being very foolish. You should not desire to hear in your home the sound you have long prayed for of your son speaking. It is far better for you not to, for you will hear it first on a day of misfortune." Croesus didn't need an oracle to decide which son to protect. Croesus immediately found a wife for Ottis, withdrew him from the army, and removed all javelins, spears, and similar weapons of war away from his son. Ottis hated this, but Croesus couldn't care less. While Croesus was preparing for his son's marriage, a strange man named Adrastus arrived in Sardis. He wasn't Lydian, but Phrygian and from a royal family. However, he had blood on his hands, the blood of his brother whom he mistakenly killed in an accident. In accordance with local custom, he sought purification, and Croesus graciously purified him. Croesus also invited him to dwell in his court as a friend of the family, encouraging him to let go of his past and accept a new life as a Lydian. Adrastus accepted. Shortly after this, a boar began disturbing the locals, destroying their crops. So they ran to Croesus, begging him to send his son Ottis and his finest men to kill the boar. Croesus agreed to send his finest men, but Ottis was going nowhere. It was at this point that Ottis protested against his father, demanding to know why he was being treated like a child. Croesus responded by telling him about the dream, and after he was done, Ottis understood and responded, saying that there was no way a boar would kill him with an iron spearhead because, if the apparition had told you that a tusk or something like that was going to cause my death, then of course you should have taken these precautions. But in fact, it was a spear, so since it's not men we're going up against, please let me go. Ottis's argument was convincing enough to let Croesus go, but he urged Adrastus the Phrygian to follow him. Croesus instructed Adrastus to be his son's bodyguard and ensure no bandits ambushed him on the road. He was to keep Ottis safe at all costs. Adrastus was reluctant, but he ultimately agreed. Later on, when Ottis, Adrastus, and the elite young fighting men found the boar, they began throwing their spears at it. Then Adrastus threw his spear, missed it, and hit Croesus' son. Ottis died on the spot, fulfilling the prophecy of Croesus' dream. Croesus was devastated by the news, and more devastated that he had taken his son's killer into his home. Eventually, he forgave Adrastus because he recognized that the man was just a tool of the fates. Then, Croesus gave his son a quiet burial. Meanwhile, Adrastus was wrecked by grief and guilt. He couldn't bring himself to approach Croesus. So that night, after the burial of Ottis, he took his own life. Croesus' fortune had turned to misfortune. For the next 2 years, the Lydian king grieved the loss of his son. 2 years was enough because when word got to Croesus that a Persian king named Cyrus had overthrown his grandfather, Astyages, taking the throne to the Median Empire, an empire that was stretched from the east, the Parthians, to the Lydian frontiers in the west, Croesus knew his kingdom was next. He knew that he had to attack first, but before that, he needed foresight. He consulted the Oracle of Delphi, asking if he would succeed in a war against the Persians. The oracle's response was ambiguous. If Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus concluded that the empire the oracle was referring to was Cyrus's Persian Empire, and he went ahead with the war. But the Persian king defeated him on the plain of Sardis, laid siege on the Lydian capital, and captured him because he wanted Croesus alive. This is what made the Lydian king's capture interesting, because the soldier that would capture him alive almost killed him first because he didn't recognize him. It was Croesus' deaf-mute son that cried out saying, "Don't kill Croesus." Those were his first words, fulfilling prophecy once more. Much later, the oracle would also reveal that the main reason his empire crumbled was because it was time. Candalu's revenge had happened during Croesus' lifetime, just as it was predicted. Now in the hands of Cyrus, Croesus' fate was sealed. The Persian king ordered him to be burnt alive. They tied Croesus along with 14 Lydian boys to a huge funeral pyre. Herodotus wasn't sure why Cyrus went through this much trouble. Could it be that he intended to offer Croesus and the boys as a sacrifice to his gods? Or was it because he wanted to test the gods of Croesus to see if they would come to his rescue? Whatever it was, in that moment, Croesus remembered the wisdom of Solon the Athenian. the man who told him that happiness could not be determined until the individual in question was dead and gone. Croesus realized Solon was right. If he died on this pyre, he wouldn't be the happiest man on earth. Solon was right. Meanwhile, Cyrus watched as Croesus mumbled Solon's name to himself. And when he asked his translators to find out what Croesus was saying, the disgraced Lydian king explained who Solon was and the story of how they met. Already the fire was blazing. The translators returned to Cyrus, and the Persian king found Croesus' story profound. He had a change of heart. Now he wanted the Lydian king to live, but the fire raged. It was too late. In a fit of desperation, Croesus called on Apollo, and according to an account told to Herodotus, Apollo answered with rain that killed the fire and saved Croesus' life. If Cyrus was impressed by Croesus' words, now he was more impressed by his faith. Now he wanted the former king by his side as an advisor. It was a role Croesus gracefully accepted, and this was how the reign of the first non-Greek to attack the Greek people came to an end. From here on, Herodotus would document the exploits of the next non-Greek aggressor, the Persian king Cyrus, and the empire he built with bloody conquest. Along with the Median Empire and the Kingdom of Lydia, Cyrus conquered most of West and Central Asia to create the world's first global superpower, the Achaemenid Empire. As Herodotus wrote down these stories of blood and war, he studied the customs of the people Cyrus conquered. He began with the customs of the conquerors themselves, the customs of the Persian people. The ancient Persians did not build temples or statues to their gods like the Greeks did. They believed those who constructed statues, temples, and altars to their gods were fools. They worshipped their gods on the highest mountain peaks. There, they made sacrifices to Zeus, Aphrodite, the sun, the moon, the earth, fire, water, and the winds. However, the Persians celebrated birthdays like the Greeks did. They felt, like the Greeks did, that it was the most important day in a person's year, and they celebrated accordingly. Unlike the Greeks, the Persians were not heavy eaters. In fact, they made fun of the Greeks with this saying, "Greeks remain hungry at the end of every meal." Instead, the Persians loved wine. They loved it so much that when they made up laws and discussed important matters, they would first argue the matter sober. Then they would argue the same matter drunk, and if they came to the same conclusion in both states of awareness, they accepted the verdict. On issues of class and social standing, you could tell whether two Persians were on the same level by how they greeted themselves. If they were on the same level, they would kiss each other on the lips. If one was slightly lower than the other, they'd kiss each other on the cheeks. And if one of them was clearly inferior, he had to fall to the ground and prostrate himself in front of the higher class man. One more detail that set the Persians apart from the Greeks was how open they were to adopting parts of other cultures they traded with or conquered. As Herodotus pointed out, they wear Median clothes because they consider them to be more attractive than their own, and they wear Egyptian breastplates for fighting. They also placed a lot of importance on bearing sons. Having sons was so important that every year, the king gave a huge reward to the man with the most sons. The Persians also had a pretty forward-thinking justice system. No Persian subject was allowed to execute anyone who had been accused of only a single crime, not even their house slaves. In contrast, they had censorship rules that were pretty strict. Anything they were not allowed to do, they were also forbidden to speak about. However, the two most shameful things in Persian culture were lies and debt. The Persians believed that lies were worse than debt because anyone who was in debt was more prone to tell more lies. The customs get more bizarre when you consider how they don't allow their people to wash their hands in rivers, urinate, or spit into them because they worship it. And it gets even more bizarre when you consider that a Persian man or woman couldn't be buried until it had been mauled by a bird or a dog. After Persia, Herodotus traveled to the magnificent city of Babylon. There, he wrote about the Babylonian people, whose customs were further from the Greek than the Persians were. Herodotus found that the Babylonians buried their dead in honey. The Babylonians had no physicians. Because of this, sick Babylonians would sit in the city center. and anyone who had recovered from their illness gave them advice. It was a mandatory Babylonian custom. Herodotus also found 3 tribes amongst the Babylonians that ate nothing but fish, and they were quite creative with it. After catching the fish and letting them dry in the sun, they would toss them into salty water, then mish them with tools and filter out the bits through cloth. After that, they either mixed them into a soft dough-like cake or baked it like bread. The Babylonians might have had unusual customs, but their city was as unusual as it was utterly magnificent. Herodotus described Babylon as a majestic city that sat on a vast square expanse with a circumference of 60 miles. It was surrounded by a deep moat and formidable walls. It was also divided by the Euphrates River and had a second inner wall where houses were 3 to 4 stories high. The city also had impenetrable brass gates. This was the city Herodotus says Cyrus wanted to conquer. And to raise the stakes, the Babylonians were expecting him. So they locked up their gates, stocked up food and supplies behind their walls, awaiting the Persian king's siege. Their plan was simple: to exhaust and outlast him. Meanwhile, Cyrus was still some distance away, on the other side of a river called Gindis that stood between him and Babylon. Cyrus was about to build boats to cross the river when one of his sacred white horses walked into its waters. The river current seized the horse, swept it away, and drowned it in its depths. Cyrus was furious. He responded by laying a curse on the river, saying, "In future, even women would cross it easily without wetting their knees." Then he postponed his advance on Babylon and divided his army into parts. He marked 180 trenches on each side of the river Gindis and ordered his men to dig, scattering the strength of Gindis into 360 channels. This was how he punished the river. This was how they crossed it. While Herodotus was in the city of Babylon, he was told stories of Babylon's most perverse custom. By our modern standards, the Babylonian marriage market. This custom existed before Cyrus the Great conquered the city. Herodotus was told it was an auction for all the young women in Babylon. Once a year, the women who were old enough to get married were taken to a certain place in the city, and a crowd of Babylonian men would form a circle around them there. An auctioneer would get each of the women to stand up one by one, and he would put her up for sale. He would start with the prettiest girls. When they had been sold off as wives to the wealthiest Babylonian men for hefty prices, he moved on to the next attractive women until he had sold off all the good-looking women. The least attractive women ended up getting sold for measly amounts to common men, and the ugly or handicapped women often went for heavily discounted prices. Herodotus pointed out that the reasons why the ugly women even got sold was because auctioneers were able to set off their loss with the excess profit they got from selling the beautiful women. No one was allowed to arrange his own daughter's marriage to a man of his choice. Everything had to be done at the auction. Every man who bought a wife also had to live with her. However, they could be returned if they found themselves incompatible. We would think of this custom as barbaric today. For Herodotus, it was their finest custom. After the Persians conquered Babylon, the city faced both societal and economic ruin, abandoning this custom. As the years passed, this custom quickly evolved into something more perverse. Fast forward to Herodotus' time, and Babylonian commoners who lacked an income pimped out their female children for money. After Cyrus and his army punished the Gindis and crossed it, they advanced on the city of Babylon. At first, they met and defeated the Babylonian army in battle near Opis, located north of the capital city of Babylon in modern-day Iraq. Then, Cyrus and his army arrived and laid siege on Babylon. It didn't work, and the Babylonians were right. The city was impenetrable. So impenetrable that the Babylonians would routinely mock Cyrus and his army from the top of their mighty walls. This continued for almost a year until someone in the Persian ranks came to Cyrus with a simple yet brilliant solution. The Euphrates River ran through the city, under the walls through one end and out the other. Cyrus got his men to dig a channel that redirected the lake into a marshy lake, and as the water levels lowered, the Persians entered Babylon through the riverbed. The Babylonians had no idea what Cyrus was planning before it was too late. The vast size of their city contributed to Cyrus's element of surprise. That day, Babylon fell to the Persians. Now, Cyrus could call himself the King of Kings, King of the four corners of the world, King of the Achaemenid Empire. About 46 years before Herodotus was born, Cyrus had conquered it all. He had conquered both the ancient kingdoms of Assyria and Babylon. His empire stretched from modern Turkey all the way to modern Afghanistan. His empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, was the world's largest, but it was not enough. There was still more to be conquered. Up north in the vast Eurasian grasslands of present-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But these enemies he was about to deal with were a different breed. The Massagetae were a large tribe, the wandering type, but they were terribly fierce on the battlefield. They drank milk from their female horses, and their men had sex with any women they wanted within their tribe. This was their way. When a tribe member grew too old to care for, his relatives got together and sacrificially killed him along with his livestock. Then they took the flesh, combined it, cooked it, and feasted. The Massagetans did not farm. They got their food from the abundant cattle and fish along and in the Araxes River. The only god they worshipped was the sun, and they offered him horses as sacrifice. They did this because they believed the only fitting sacrifice for their god was the fastest creature on earth. Herodotus noted that they resembled the Scythians in both their clothing and lifestyle. Scythians was a broad term used for Indo-Eurasians that lived within that region. There was no doubt that the Massagetans were a tribe different from any of the tribes the King of Kings had brought under his rule. They were a different breed, and yet these were the people that Cyrus was eager to bring under his rule. At the time, the Massagetae was ruled by a widowed king named Tomarus. Cyrus sent a message to her asking for her hand in marriage. But Tomarus could see the trickery for what it was. Cyrus wasn't asking her to be his queen, he was looking for an excuse to subjugate her people without conflict. So she declined his request. That was all the excuse that Cyrus needed. He immediately began his campaign against the Massagetae, but he first sought the counsel of his advisors. Croesus was still alive, and he was still Cyrus's most trusted advisor. The former Lydian king advised Cyrus to set a trap for the Massagetae army. They crossed into Massagetan's territory and left a small force of Persians as bait along with a banquet of food and wine. The Massagetae army, led by Tomarus' son Spargapaces, met the Persians in battle. They defeated the Persians they found and began feasting on their food and wine. Before the Persians, the Massagetans had never taken wine. They were not used to the effects of alcohol. So Spargapaces and the Massagetan army quickly became drunk. Croesus' plan worked. Cyrus and his main army made quick work of the drunk Massagetae and captured Spargapaces, Tomarus' son. Cyrus planned to use him as a bargaining chip to get Tomarus to surrender. But when Tomarus heard what had happened, she was enraged. In a fit of maddening rage, she sent a strongly worded letter to the King of Kings warning him, "You bloodthirsty man, Cyrus, you use the fruit of the vine to overcome my son rather than conquering him by force in battle. Now I am giving good advice, so listen carefully. Give me back my son, and then you can leave this country without paying for the brutality with which you treated a third of the Massagetan army. But if you do not, I swear by the sun who is the lord of the Massagetae that for all your insatiability, I will quench your thirst for blood." Cyrus ignored this threat when he received it. To make matters worse, Spargapaces took his own life after tricking Cyrus into freeing him. Without his bargaining chip and now in enemy territory, Cyrus rallied his armies against the Massagetans. Herodotus called the war that followed the fiercest battle between non-Greeks that had ever been. Unfortunately for Cyrus, the Massagetans won. Most of the Persian forces were wiped out. Cyrus was killed and decapitated upon Queen Tomarus' request. She had promised Cyrus that she would quench his thirst for blood in the letter she sent. Though I live and conquer thee, thou hast undone me, overcoming my son by guile. But even as I threatened, so will I do, and give thee thy fill of blood. Queen Tomarus of the Massagetans held up to that promise by dunking the King of Kings' severed head into a wineskin filled with human blood. After the death of Cyrus, his son Cambyses II took the throne and became the new King of Kings. His first order of business was to subjugate ancient Egypt. Herodotus would have been somewhere between 26 to 30 when he traveled to Egypt to hear the accounts firsthand from the priests of Memphis, the ancient city's capital. And as the priests relayed the stories to him, Herodotus immersed himself and took note of their culture, which happened to share a lot of similarities and yet was still very different from the culture of the Greek. The priests said that the Egyptians originally believed they were the oldest race on Earth. But after Psammetichus, the first pharaoh of the 26th dynasty, investigated the claim, they accepted second place after the Phrygians. According to the Egyptian priests Herodotus spoke to, Psammetichus conducted an experiment where he ordered 2 infants to be brought up in a remote place by a shepherd, who was forbidden to speak in their presence. His logic was that whatever word they spoke first would determine which race was oldest, since there was no one around them to imitate. After 2 years, the children began to speak, and the word they repeated most often was bekos, which turned out to be the Phrygian word for bread. Since they had grown up in isolation and no one had spoken to them, Psammetichus concluded that the Phrygians were the oldest race, and all of Egypt agreed. The Egyptians were different from the Greeks in a lot of different things. Their culture was almost an inversion of the Greeks in some aspect. For example, while the Egyptian women went out to the town square to retail goods, the Egyptian men stayed at home to do the weaving, a direct opposite of Greek customs. Herodotus also noted that Egyptian men carried loads on their heads, while women carried loads on their shoulders. Women urinated standing up, while men did their business squatting. Ancient Egyptians in general relieved themselves indoors but ate outside on the streets, and their reason for this was, things that are embarrassing but unavoidable should be done in private, while things which are not embarrassing should be done out in the open. They had no female priestesses for any of their gods or goddesses. All of their gods and goddesses were served in this capacity by men. Everywhere in the world, priests had long hair, but in ancient Egypt they shaved their heads. Meanwhile, in times of mourning, most cultures would have the grieving relatives cut their hair. In Egypt, the relatives would both let their hair and beards grow. The Egyptians kneaded dough with their feet and clay with their hands, and picked up feces with their hands too. The Egyptians also practiced circumcision. Greeks moved their hands from left to right while writing. Egyptians moved theirs from right to left. The ancient Egyptians were also as religious as they were clean. Cleaner than the Greeks. Everyone scrubbed the bronze cup they used for drinking every day, and their cloaks always had to be freshly washed every day. As Herodotus would note, the Egyptians valued cleanliness above appearance. Herodotus found a lot of similarities between the gods of Egypt and his Greek gods. While he noted that Egyptians didn't all worship the same gods, both Isis and Osiris were considered holy all over Egypt. He drew parallels between the Egyptian Osiris and the Greek Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of wine. Herodotus found that the celebration of Osiris in Egypt was very similar to the festival of Dionysus in Greece. There was a lot of drinking and wild parties. However, the priests in ancient Egypt had to follow strict cleanliness rituals that included shaving their bodies every other day, and wearing specific garments made of linen and papyrus shoes. Despite their strict routines, priests enjoy benefits. They were the responsibility of the Egyptian people. They were provided free food, including sacredly cooked meals of beef, goose meat, and wine. However, they weren't allowed to eat fish, and they considered beans impure, so they avoided it too. Now, like many other civilizations at the time, the Egyptians considered pigs to be unclean. They avoided pigs so much that anyone who brushed themselves against a pig had to dip themselves in a river to clean themselves with their clothes on. It was so bad that if you were unfortunate enough to be the daughter or son of a swineherd, no one that wasn't a swineherd would marry you. The only time pigs were allowed was during the worship of Osiris during the full moon. This was the only time Egyptians were allowed to touch, cut, and eat pigs. Only on that day, and no day before or after. Goats and cats, on the other hand, were practically worshipped by the Egyptians. Egyptians did not sacrifice goats of either gender because they counted Pan as one of the 8 primordial gods of the Egyptian people, and Pan was portrayed with a goat's head and a he-goat's legs. The goat worship was so devout and so intense that Herodotus mentioned seeing a woman mate with a goat in public during his time there. Cats and dogs were also highly revered. If a cat died a natural death in a family's house, every member of that family would shave their eyebrows. And if a dog died, they would shave their whole bodies, head and all. If a house was burning, the owner would save their cat first before they bothered about their house. Cats were also mummified and buried after death in a sacred chamber. Dogs were also mummified, but they were buried beside their owner. The Egyptians were obsessed with the mummification process. Mongooses, shrews, hawks, bears, wolves, and crocodiles all got mummified after death. There were professional embalmers who specialized in this work. Herodotus described 3 types of mummification processes. In the first method, the embalmer would extract the brain by passing a hooked iron instrument through the corpse's nostrils, extracting part of the brain and liquefying the rest. Then, they would cut open the side of the corpse, remove all the intestines, and clean out the cavity, rinsing it with palm wine and crushed spices. After this, they filled the corpse's belly with more perfumed spices before sewing it back up. The next and final phase involved packing the corpse in natron, a drying agent that is still used to this day. The corpse was left to mummify for 70 days. After the 70 days was up, the whole of the mummy's body would then be wrapped in bandages made out of fine linen cloth cut into sticky strips. The relatives would collect the corpse, make a hollow casket in the shape of a man, and enclose the corpse inside it. Once the corpse had been shut away inside the casket, they stored it upright against the wall of a burial chamber. The process was the most expensive and the best. Herodotus was deeply fascinated by the Nile River. He noticed that the Egyptians depended on the river to water their crops, while the Greeks depended on it for rain from the gods. The Egyptians found the Greek dependence on rain silly, noting that the Greek would starve the day the gods refused to give them rain. Herodotus agreed, but he also pointed out that the Egyptians would starve if the Nile dried up or didn't flood its banks. It was from this argument that Herodotus began to ask questions. Why did the Nile flood? And more importantly, where did the Nile come from? What was its source? The first question, why the Nile flooded, had already been answered by some Greeks before him, but Herodotus found the answers to be nonsensical. One of such answers claimed that the water of the Nile came from the melting snow caps from the mountains of Ethiopia that flowed into the rivers, causing a flood in the Nile. Today, we know that this answer is at least half right, but Herodotus felt it was wrong because he could not conceive the idea that there was snow in a region as hot as Africa. Instead, he favored a more backward engineered approach. He believed that the north wind blew the sun through the sky up to Egypt in winter. The sun sucked up the waters that flooded over the Egyptian fields, and that is why the water of the Nile was low in winter. So, what about the source? A scribe of the sacred treasury of Athena, the Egyptian goddess Neith, told Herodotus that there was a border town in the south of ancient Egypt called Elephantine. It was an island on the Nile shaped like an elephant's tusk. The waters around the island were turbulent, which made it impossible to travel by boat along that river. The scribe told Herodotus that the waters of the Nile flowed up from a bottomless pit hidden below the swirling whirlpools at Elephantine. Allegedly, the Egyptian king Psammetichus proved that the pit was bottomless when he ordered his servants to make a long rope and lower it down into the pit. They exhausted the rope and could not find the bottom. Of course, the scribe was wrong about this, but it was true that Elephantine was the place where the Nile entered Egypt. Today, the Elephantine Island can be found in the middle of the Nile River in the city of Aswan. Ultimately, Herodotus would call Egypt a gift of the Nile River. In this, he was correct. Without the Nile, there wouldn't have been an Egyptian civilization. It would never have existed, because even to this day, about 95% of Egypt's population live within 12 miles of the Nile. There was an interesting account in Herodotus' histories about a pharaoh named Rhampsinitus. According to the priests who Herodotus spoke to, Rhampsinitus amassed a huge fortune and commissioned a specially constructed, impenetrable chamber where he kept all his wealth. Unknown to the pharaoh, the builder of his chamber created a secret entry for himself. After some time, the builder fell ill, and on his deathbed he called his 2 sons and informed them of the secret entry into the king's chamber. He encouraged them to rob the king, telling them this way they would be rich after he had passed. After their father died, the brothers made their way to the chamber, found the secret entrance, and stole as much as they could from the king's fortune. They stole enough that the king noticed and wondered how it happened, especially because there was no sign of forced entry and the seals on the doors were intact. The 2 brothers robbed again and again till the king suspected that the thefts were either an inside job or the result of someone using a secret entrance. So Rhampsinitus ordered his men to set booby traps within the chambers. It worked. The next time the brothers came visiting, one of them got caught in the king's trap and could not free himself. As dawn crept closer, the brothers knew they had to act quickly to avoid capture. The trapped brother, realizing the danger of being identified, asked his free brother to cut off his head. It wasn't an easy request, but the reasoning was clear. Without his head, he couldn't be recognized. So he decapitated his brother, leaving his brother's headless corpse in the chamber. It worked. The king found the headless culprit, but couldn't identify who he was. So he ordered his guards to hang the body on the city walls for all to see. Anyone caught mourning the sight would be seen as connected to the thief and brought before the king for questioning. The thief's mother recognized her son's headless body and pleaded with her surviving son to retrieve it for a proper burial. She threatened to expose his theft to the king if he refused. The surviving son came up with a plan to retrieve his brother's body. He approached the corpse's guard on a donkey, carrying several large skins of wine. When he knew the guards could see him, he deliberately spilled the wine to distract the guards, who rushed to stop the wine from wasting and began drinking it themselves. Soon enough, they were so drunk that they slept off. Once the guards were completely drunk, the surviving son cut down the body of his headless sibling, loaded it onto the donkey, and left. King Rhampsinitus was outraged when he heard what happened, so he came up with another plan to catch this evasive thief. The king ordered his daughter to work as a prostitute in a well-known brothel and tasked her with questioning every client about the theft of the headless corpse. She was instructed not to engage in intimate acts until the client had answered 2 specific questions. What is the cleverest and the most wicked thing you have done in your life? If anyone revealed information about the theft of the king's treasury or the theft of the headless corpse, she should immediately identify him and grab his arm. When the actual thief found out about this plan, he decided to prove he was more cunning than the king one last time. So he got a human arm from an embalmer and brought it into the brothel with him. When the king's daughter asked him what the cleverest and most wicked things he had done, the thief told her that the worst thing he had done was decapitate his own brother when he was caught in a trap in the king's treasure chamber, and that the cleverest thing he had done was get the guards drunk and cut his brother's corpse down from the city wall. The king's daughter heard him and tried to grab his hand, but she grabbed the fake hand and the thief escaped. When the king heard, he was more impressed than he was pissed. He sent men all around the city to announce that the thief would be fully pardoned if he would make himself known. The thief chose to trust Rhampsinitus and visited the palace where the king offered his daughter's hand in marriage to him. Impressed by the thief's intelligence, the king remarked, "No one can surpass this man's cleverness. We Egyptians are known for our wit, but he outshines us all." While Herodotus was speaking to the priests at Memphis, he was told after Rhampsinitus came Cheops. Cheops' reign was awful. The Egyptians called him Khufu. Cheops closed down all the sanctuaries, stopped his subjects from performing sacrifices, and also forced them to work for him. More specifically, he forced them to build what would become the biggest pyramid, the Pyramid of Giza. Some of the Egyptian laborers were forced to haul blocks of stone from the quarries in the Arabian mountain range as far as the Nile, where they were transported across the river in boats. They worked in groups of 100,000 men for 3 months at a time. Herodotus says the priests told him it took 10 years of hard labor for the people to construct the causeway along which they hauled the blocks of stone. The actual pyramid itself took 20 years to build. Each of its sides were square, 800 feet long, while the pyramid itself was 800 feet high as well. It was made of polished blocks of stone, fitted together perfectly with none of the blocks being less than 30 feet long. The pyramid was built like a flight of stairs. When that first stage of the construction process was over, they used tools made of short pieces of wood to lift the remaining blocks of stone up the sides. When the stone had been raised up to that point, it was put onto a different device which was positioned on the first level, and from there, it was hauled up to the second level on another device. The topmost parts of the pyramid were finished first, then the ones just under it, down to the ground levels. The workers' daily meal consisted of radishes, onions, and garlic, and Herodotus says he saw a notice that read that the total cost was 1,600 talents of silver for the duration of the pyramid's construction. The Pyramid of Giza was and still is a sight to behold, but it didn't improve the reputation of King Cheops. The Egyptians hated him so much that years after he died, they refused to say his name, even to Herodotus. I have personally seen it, and it defies description. If someone put together all the strongholds and public monuments of the Greeks, it would be obvious that less labor and money had been expended on them than on this labyrinth. And I say this despite the fact that the temples in Ephesus and Samos are remarkable structures. This was how Herodotus described the magnificent labyrinth of Egypt built in Crocodilopolis. The labyrinth had rooms on 2 levels, an underground level and a level that was above ground level sitting on top of it. And in total, there were 3,000 rooms in all, with each level containing 1,500. Herodotus says that he went through the ground level rooms himself and saw them. However, the underground level was only described to him. The Egyptians in charge refused to show him the underground rooms because it was the tomb of the king who originally built the labyrinth. Herodotus described endless chambers, winding passages through courtyards so complicated that one turn would lead him to another chamber and into yet another courtyard different from the ones before. It was complex, massive, and breathtaking. But there was more. Herodotus says that the roof and walls of the entire structure were made of stone. He also noted that the walls had carvings of figures, and its colonnaded courtyards were made out of blocks fitted with white stones. There was a 240-feet pyramid at the end of the labyrinth. It had huge figures carved on its surface, and its entrance was built underground. The Lake of Moeris was another marvelous sight to behold. Herodotus noted that it was more marvelous than the labyrinth. He described it as an artificial lake that was 91 meters deep and 413 miles wide, making it as long as Egypt's coastline itself. The ancient pharaohs had gone to great lengths to turn it into a reservoir. However, what was even more fascinating were the 2 pyramids Herodotus claimed were built in the middle of the lake. They were huge structures that were 182 meters tall, rising 91 meters above the water. On top of each of these pyramids, there was a stone figure seated on a throne. While Herodotus was in Egypt, he was able to get an account of how the Persians had conquered the entire country, how Cambyses II conquered Egypt. Because after the wonders came the war, and Cambyses, son of Cyrus the Great, was now the king of kings. The pharaoh at the time was Amasis II, and in the several months that followed, he made 2 grave errors that led to the capture of Egypt. Amasis made his first mistake when he sent one of his eye doctors to serve Cambyses on the Persian king's request. The doctor felt betrayed by his king and decided to take revenge. Amasis' second error was tricking the Persian king. The Egyptian doctor had urged Cambyses to ask Amasis for his daughter's hand in marriage. He knew that Amasis would die before he gave his daughter to a Persian. He also knew if Amasis refused the Persian king, they would become enemies. So instead of sending his daughter, Amasis sent the daughter of the previous king. Immediately she arrived at the court of Cambyses, she revealed the trickery to him. Cambyses was furious and decided to conquer Egypt. Or at least that is what Herodotus was told. One final piece that led to the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses II had to do with a man named Phanes, a native of Halicarnassus. He was a councilman and the most experienced tactical advisor in the court of Amasis. But over time, they grew to hate each other, so Phanes defected. At the time, Cambyses was already preparing for the Egyptian campaign, but he didn't know what route to take. It was Phanes who helped Cambyses and showed him the way and gave him the advice that led to the conquest of Egypt. Cambyses was wise. Despite having full control over the Neo-Babylonian Empire and its sub-regions, including northern Arabia, he still sent a message to the king of Arabia requesting permission through the desert road from Gaza to Pelusium in Egypt. Arabia and Egypt were bitter rivals, and the king of Arabia was more than glad to help any cause that would ruin Egypt. So when Cambyses asked for permission, the Arabian king granted it and offered him help. But before the war could begin, Amasis passed away peacefully. His son, Samanidas, inherited his father's throne, and his father's war with the King of Kings. But without Phanes, the councilman and tactical advisor who betrayed all of Egypt to the Persians, Samanidas was doomed. However, he remained in command of the Egyptian army. Just before the war, they rounded up the sons of Phanes, slit their throats on the battlefield, and in full view of the Persian force, drained the blood in a bowl of wine, mixed it, and drank it. This was their revenge against Phanes for bringing a foreign army into Egypt. The war that followed was terrible, but the Persians fought until the Egyptians fled from the battlefield. Cambyses wanted to take Egypt peacefully, so he sent a Persian to Memphis on a Mytilenean ship to suggest a truce. But the Egyptians smashed the ship and slaughtered everyone on board, tearing the crew apart limb from limb and carrying the remains back inside their walls. For this act of treachery, Cambyses not only conquered Memphis, he killed 10 leading Egyptian men for every man that was killed and dismembered. Then, Cambyses killed Samanidas' son, but spared his life. Much later, Samanidas would take his own life after trying and failing to start a rebellion against the Persian king. But there was still unfinished business. Despite the fact that he had conquered all of Egypt, Cambyses was incensed that he could not have his revenge on the dead king who had insulted him with his trickery. So he ordered his men to bring out the mummified corpse of Amasis. He ordered them to flog it, whip it, pierce it with spears, and pull out its hair. When they were done, Cambyses ordered for the corpse to be burnt. Cremation was considered an abomination in both Persian and Egyptian culture, because while the Persians considered fire to be a god, the Egyptians considered fire to be a living creature. So by burning Amasis' corpse, Cambyses had violated both Persian and Egyptian customs. After Egypt, Cambyses set his sights on Ethiopia. He sent spies disguised as emissaries bearing gifts of a purple cloak, gold, perfumes, and wine to the king of Ethiopia. But the king of Ethiopia saw right through them and called them out as spies. But he didn't punish them. Instead, he showed his kingdom to them. They found that the average Ethiopian lived longer than the average Persian by 40 years. They were also better looking. The spies were shown a lake where Ethiopians bathed. It looked like olive oil and gave off the scent of violets. They also saw Egyptian slaves wearing huge shackles made out of gold, bigger than the gold they had offered the king. The only thing the Ethiopian king admitted the Persians did better than them was wine. When he was done showing the treacherous tourists his kingdom, he unstrung a bow. Then he gave them the bow as a gift to Cambyses, along with a warning. Here is a word of advice from the king of the Ethiopians. When the Persians can draw bows of this size as easily as I do now, then he can march against the long-lived Ethiopians, with an army that considerably outnumbers yours. In the meantime, he should be grateful to the gods for not making the sons of Ethiopia think of acquiring additional lands besides their own. When Cambyses received the gift and the warning, he was incensed. Immediately, he set out on an expedition to conquer Ethiopia. But it was doomed from the start, because as Herodotus pointed out, Ethiopia was on the ends of the earth. It was far enough that by the time they reached a fifth of the journey, his army ran out of food. Then they ran out of yoke animals because the men had eaten it all. Cambyses insisted on continuing because, according to him, there was still grass and plants to survive on. By the time they got to the desert, his men had resorted to cannibalism, and soon they began casting lots to choose 10 men among them for food. This was what made Cambyses give up on his Ethiopian campaign and return to Egypt. There was a tragic misunderstanding between Cambyses and the Egyptians. When he returned to Egypt after the failed conquest of Ethiopia, the Egyptians were feasting and dancing, celebrating the festival of Apis, bull god of fertility and the underworld. Cambyses was convinced they were mocking him, so he summoned the governors of Memphis and asked them why the Egyptians were celebrating. The governors told Cambyses about the festival of Apis. Cambyses accused them of lying and ordered their execution. Then he summoned the priests of Apis. They gave him the same response the governors had, but Cambyses wasn't convinced, so he summoned Apis himself to appear before him. Now, Apis was a literal calf born from a cow chosen by a beam of light that descended on it from the sky. Cambyses stabbed Apis in the thigh and mocked both the priests and the Egyptian people, saying, "You poor fools! Is this what gods are like? Are they creatures of flesh and blood, capable of being wounded by weapons? Well, this is the god you Egyptians deserve, but you won't get away with making me a laughingstock." Cambyses ordered the priests to be flogged. He outlawed the worship of Apis and ordered anyone who worshipped the god to be killed. Meanwhile, Apis would die from the thigh wound inflicted by Cambyses. Cambyses wasn't just frustrated, he had gone crazy, and his insanity grew with each day, because his next target was his brother, Smerdis, whom he suddenly suspected of treason. Smerdis was the only one who had managed to draw the bow the Ethiopians sent. This caused Cambyses to be jealous, so Cambyses sent him to Persia. Then, after he had a dream where Smerdis was sitting on his throne with his head in the clouds, Cambyses sent Praxipes, the Persian he trusted the most, to kill him. After killing his brother, Cambyses forcefully married his younger sister. Then he fell in love with another of his sisters, killed the one he married, and took this other sister as a new wife. But the insanity had just begun. His Persian subjects had begun to gossip about his insanity and question his reign. So, to prove how sane he was to Praxipes and the Persian people, Cambyses shot an arrow into the heart of Praxipes' son from his throne. His logic was, if he was truly insane, he wouldn't have made the shot. As Cambyses turned into a mad king in Egypt, two Magi brothers, Patizaethes and Smerdis, rebelled against him in Persia. No one knew Cambyses had killed his brother. The Persian people didn't even know the Persian prince, Smerdis, was dead. Only Cambyses and Praxipes were aware. Somehow, the Magi brothers had found out when they noticed his absence, so they hatched a plan. One of the Magi brothers, Smerdis, resembled and shared his name with the deceased prince. Patizaethes plotted to usurp the kingdom by tricking the Persian people into thinking his brother Smerdis was Cambyses' younger brother. So messengers were sent to spread the message that the new ruler of Persia was Smerdis, not Cambyses. When Cambyses heard this message, he thought Praxipes had betrayed him by sparing Smerdis. But Praxipes defended himself and insisted that he carried out the mission as ordered. Praxipes went to Persia to investigate the matter himself. There, he discovered the treachery of the Magi brothers and sent word back to Cambyses. It was at that moment that Cambyses remembered the dream he had. Smerdis sitting on his throne with his head in the clouds. It wasn't his brother the dream was warning him about, it was the Magi. Cambyses realized he shouldn't have killed his brother, and this affected him deeply, so he decided to confront the Magi himself. In a tragic turn of events, while attempting to ride to Susa to face the Magi brothers, Cambyses hurt himself in the thigh with his sword, in the same spot he had previously wounded the Egyptian god Apis. It was a fatal wound, and he was sure he would die. So before his death, Cambyses confessed to the important Persians present, expressing regret for killing his own brother and warning them of the Magian threat. He urged them to reclaim power, encouraging them to use any means possible to regain control. But they didn't believe him because they thought it was the crazed rambling of a dying king. 20 days after the accident, Cambyses died, childless with no heir to his throne. After the death of Cambyses, the Persians mourned their king's passing, but the Magus brothers had successfully tricked them into thinking the fake Smerdis was the real brother of Cambyses, son of Cyrus. This fake Smerdis continued to rule for 7 months and was very generous towards the Persian people, so they loved him. But the elites and ruling class of Persia were suspicious. Specifically, a nobleman named Otanes, whose daughter named Phaedamia had married Cambyses and was now married to the fake Smerdis, the Magi, as a result of his ascent to the throne. So he sent a message to his daughter instructing her to feel for Smerdis' ears while he was asleep to determine if he was the true son of Cyrus or an impostor. When Cyrus was alive, he chopped off the ear of the fake Smerdis for a crime he committed. Later that night, Phaedamia confirmed Otanes' fears. The Smerdis on the throne was, in fact, the Magi brother. Otanes revealed this discovery to other noble Persians, including Darius, the son of Hystopes, who was the second cousin of Cyrus the Great. Together, these nobles decided to overthrow the Magus. Darius was eager to act quickly, so he convinced the others to strike immediately because he was certain they would be betrayed if they waited. While this was happening, the Magi brothers worked hard to win Praxipes to their side, because they believed he was the only one who knew the truth about Smerdis' death. They promised him land and wealth. In return, Praxipes would announce to the Persian people that the fake Smerdis was the legitimate king of kings. However, Praxipes used the opportunity to confess and reveal the Magi's deception to all of Persia. He explained to them how he helped Cambyses kill Smerdis, then he exposed the Magus on the throne as an impostor. When he was done, Praxipes took his life by throwing himself off a tower. The 6 noblemen, along with Darius, killed the Magus brothers, and they crowned Darius as the new king of the Achaemenid Empire. When Darius became king, he divided the kingdom into 20 districts. The Indian district specifically brought a tribute of gold dust to the Persian king, and Herodotus wrote about them. The Indians resided in the far eastern part of Asia and lived in diverse tribes with varying languages and lifestyles. Some of them were nomadic, while others lived in river marshes, wearing clothes made of plants. The Pata'i tribe, east of the Marsh Indians, had a custom of eating raw meat. They were also quite cannibalistic. If a member in their group, man or woman, got sick, their closest friends would kill them. They believed that if the sick person got worse, their flesh would spoil. Even if the sick person denied being ill, their friends would ignore their protests, kill them, and then have a feast. The same rule applied to women who fell sick. Her closest female friends would follow the same procedure. They also sacrificed and ate anyone who got old. However, an old tribe member was rare because most of them were actually killed before they got old. Surprisingly, there was another Indian tribe that refrained from killing. They also don't grow crops or build houses. Instead, they relied on naturally growing vegetable seed for sustenance. And if any of their tribe members fell ill, they went to a remote location to rest. No tribe member would check on them even if they died on that spot. Now, concerning the gold that the Indians had, it belonged to the Indians near the Cospaturus and Paktikan territory. North of the rest of the Indians, they had a reputation for their warlike nature and for their expeditions in search of gold in a sandy desert. In this same desert, Herodotus described massive ants, the size of foxes, that dug up sand filled with gold. There is no evidence that ants of this size existed even before Herodotus' time. Today, many experts believe he might have been referring to Himalayan marmots. Whatever it was, this is where the Indians got their gold from. They used teams of 3 camels, timing their expeditions to coincide with the hottest part of the day when the fox-sized ants retreat underground. When the Indians reached their destination, they filled their bags with sand and promptly headed back home. According to the Persian belief, the ants have an acute sense of smell, and they also happen to be the fastest creatures on Earth. Once they detect the Indians, they pursue them. During this chase, the Indians will sometimes leave the slower male camels to distract the pursuing ants. While the Indians brought gold to Darius, the Arabians offered spices. Herodotus described Arabia as the farthest south inhabited place on Earth. It is also the only place that produces frankincense, myrrh, cassia, cinnamon, and rock rose resin. All of these spices except myrrh were difficult to get, but the Arabians had their ways. The Arabians got frankincense from a specific tree that was guarded by lots of small, spotted winged snakes. To get the spice from the tree, the Arabians had to burn storax resin to ward off the snakes. Cassia could be found in a shallow lake surrounded by winged creatures resembling bats, which were hostile and made a frightful noise when spooked. Arabians got past the bat-like creatures by wrapping their entire bodies and faces, except for their eyes, in oxhide and other leathers. However, they had to also protect their eyes. The origin of cinnamon is uncertain, but some believe it grew where Dionysus was raised. Arabians claim that large birds carried cinnamon sticks to their nests built on inaccessible cliffs. To obtain cinnamon, Arabians placed large pieces of dead yoke animals near the nests. The birds, unable to lift the heavy pieces, caused the nests to collapse, allowing Arabians to collect cinnamon from the ground. The final spice, rock rose resin, was found in the beard of he-goats. Although the location where it was found may have had an unpleasant odor, the resin itself was highly fragrant and used in various perfumes. During Herodotus' time, it was the most common incense burned by the Arabians. A little after Darius became king of Persia, and a little less after he divided his vast kingdom into districts, he faced his first real test. It involved a nobleman who was one of the 6 rebels that killed the Magus brothers and made him king. His name was Intiphanes. One of the privileges the 6 enjoyed was the ability to see the king without permission, except when he was having sex. One day, when Intiphanes came visiting, he had a bloody altercation and mutilated the king's guard because they stopped him from seeing Darius. They told him the king was having sex. He did not believe them at that time, but he would later learn they were telling the truth. When Darius heard Intiphanes' entitlement, he began to fear the rebels were conspiring against him. So he meticulously interrogated each of the 6 rebels until he was sure of the innocence of the remaining 5. Intiphanes had acted alone. Darius imprisoned Intiphanes, his sons, and all of his male relatives. Intiphanes' wife begged for mercy from the king. Darius heard her and gave her a choice to save one family member. Intiphanes' wife thought about it and chose her brother. Darius was confused. Why didn't you choose your husband or one of your sons? The woman responded that she could always remarry and she could always have another son. But her parents were dead, so she had no way of getting another brother. Impressed by this, Darius spared her brother and oldest son. However, the others, including her husband Intiphanes, were executed. A year later, Darius faced his second test on the battlefield when the Babylonians staged a well-planned revolt. They began planning the revolt at least a year before, when they heard the Magi brothers had taken the throne. They silently prepared for a siege through the Magus' rule and the insurrection that brought Darius to the throne. In what was perhaps their most desperate move, the Babylonians gathered all the women in the city, except mothers and one single woman for each family. They strangled these women to conserve supplies for the siege they knew would come. And it did. Because when Darius heard of their rebellion, he gathered his Persian army and made his way to Babylon. He besieged Babylon for a year and a half, trying every trick in the book and borrowing some of Cyrus's methods, but nothing proved effective. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of the city mocked him and taunted him from the city walls. In fact, one Babylonian stood on the city walls and mocked the Persians, saying, "What are you doing sitting there, men of Persia? Why don't you just go away? Babylon will fall into your hands only when mules start bearing young." The Babylonian assumed this would never happen because mules were known to be infertile. However, in the 20th month of the siege, a mule that belonged to Zopyrus gave birth. Zopyrus was the son of Megabyzus, one of the 6 noblemen that rebelled against the Magus brothers and brought Darius to the Persian throne. Convinced that this rare event signaled Babylon's fall, Zopyrus hatched a plan. He mutilated himself, cutting his nose and ears, and approached Darius. Darius was shocked and initially condemned the act until Zopyrus explained his plan. Zopyrus would approach the city wall of Babylon alone. He would tell the Babylonian that Darius was the one who mutilated his face, gained their trust, and convinced them to give him command of the Babylonian army. After this first phase, all Darius had to do was deploy a few thousand troops to specific places for Zopyrus to destroy. This would make the Babylonians trust Zopyrus completely. When they were comfortable enough that Zopyrus was on their side, he would open the gates of Babylon from the inside, letting the Persian troops in and recapturing Babylon for the glory of Darius. The plan worked perfectly, like a finely tuned wheel. Zopyrus tricked the Babylonians, opened their gates for the Persian forces, and Babylon fell. Darius destroyed the walls of Babylon, executed 3,000 of their most prominent men, impaling them as a warning to others. However, he allowed the remaining Babylonians to continue living there. To replenish the population, Darius ordered people from nearby settlements to send women to Babylon. This resulted in 50,000 women moving into the city. Darius celebrated Zopyrus as a Persian hero, made him governor of Babylon, exempted him from taxes for the rest of his life, and lavished gifts on him. It is said that Darius often expressed the opinion that he would prefer to see Zopyrus without his injuries than gain 20 more Babylons. After conquering Babylon, Darius set his sights on Scythia, a nomad wandering tribe that believed they were the youngest people in the world because they descended from the offsprings of Heracles. Darius hated the Scythians because they invaded the Medians, his ancestors, and conquered those who opposed them in battle. They had also enslaved its people twice, and they had a habit of blinding all of their slaves. The first time they enslaved the Mede, they chased down the Cimmerians and were away from their homeland for 28 years. While they were away, the wives of the Scythians laid with their slaves and had children. The second time the Scythians enslaved the Medians was upon their return after 28 years of absence. They met resistance from the slaves and their children. When the returning Scythians tried and failed to reclaim their home, they came up with an alternative. A Scythian proposed using horsewhips instead of weapons against the slaves. He felt the slaves were only bold because the Scythians were treating them as equals by fighting them with weapons. For some reason, this strategy worked. The slaves and their sons were confused and terrified by the horsewhips, so they scattered, and the Scythians regained control over Asia. Sometime around 441 BC, Herodotus traveled to Scythia himself and wrote extensively about them, about their geography, their customs, and practices. Herodotus found similarities between the gods the Scythians and the Greeks worshipped. He felt they were mostly the same, just under different names. Hestia was their most important deity, followed by Zeus and Earth, whom they considered to be Zeus's wife. However, unlike the Greek, they didn't create statues, altars, or temples for their gods except Ares. Also, the Scythians did not use fires or libations when conducting sacrifices for their gods. The most common creatures used for sacrifice were horses. They were killed and cooked for meat by the Scythians. Since there were very few trees in Scythia, the Scythians used the bones of sacrificial meat to cook. After cooking and before feasting on the meal, the worshippers would offer some of the meat and innards as first fruits to the gods by throwing them forward. In each province, there was a sanctuary constructed for Ares, consisting of a large pile of sticks with a square platform on top. Every year, the Scythians added sticks to the platform. When it was time for the festival, they placed an iron dagger on the platform that symbolized Ares. More domestic animals and horses were offered to the dagger than to any other god. They also offered prisoners of war to the dagger, but the prisoners were sacrificed differently. The Scythians slashed the selected prisoners' throats, and their blood was poured over the dagger. Meanwhile, the right arms of all slaughtered enemies were severed and thrown into the air. Maimed bodies were also sacrificed. In Scythian war customs, when a Scythian kills his first man, he must drink the victim's blood. After that, the Scythians must present the king with heads of those they kill because without it, they won't have a share in the spoils of war. The Scythians must also skin their victims' heads, and this process involves making a circular cut on the scalp, shaking the scalp off, scraping the skull with a cow's rib, and kneading the skin into a rag that they attach to their horse's bridle. The more skin rags a Scythian possesses, the braver they're considered by their peers. Now, the Scythians weren't the type to let a good thing go to waste. They used their enemies' skulls as cups, and if a Scythian had a falling out with one of his relatives, they fought to the death in the presence of their king. The winner treated the loser's skull the same way he treated his enemies, and when he had important visitors, the Scythian would show them the skull and share the story of how it once belonged to their relative. This was how the Scythians defined courage. The burial of the Scythian king was a bloody affair. First, a huge square pit was dug. Then the king's body was covered in wax and filled with spices, herbs, and sewn back up. The Scythians in the royal house grieved by cutting their ears, shaving their heads, slashing their arms and foreheads, mutilating their noses, and piercing their left hands with arrows. As they moved the king's body on a wagon across different tribes, every member of each tribe was expected to show their grief in the same manner as the royal Scythians. Eventually, the king's corpse was laid in a grave on a pallet, spears were placed on both sides, and a roof was constructed using wooden planks and rush matting. The remaining space within the grave was often filled with members of the king's court that had all been throttled to death. A concubine, wine server, cook, groom, steward, messenger, horses, and various possessions. The only items that weren't buried with the dead king were his silver and bronze. After this, the grave was covered with a massive mound of sand. While Herodotus was in Scythia, the Scythians gave him an account of how they had defeated the Persians without waging war against them. They were unbeatable. They spoke of how in 513 BC, 26 years before Herodotus' birth, Darius launched a campaign against the Scythians. When Darius reached the Danube, a massive river in southeastern Europe, he found a bridge waiting for him. The Ionian Greeks, allies of Persia at the time, had built it specifically for his campaign. When Darius and his Persian army crossed into what is now Romania, he ordered for the bridge to be destroyed. But one of the Ionian Greeks in his army was bold enough to suggest he shouldn't in case they had to retreat. Thankfully, Darius agreed and ordered the Ionian Greeks to wait by the bridge for 60 days. Before launching his attack on the Scythians, Darius sent an envoy to the Scythians demanding their surrender. They declined his demand. Instead, they united their tribes and formed 3 armies. However, instead of confronting the Persians in battle, the Scythians engaged in a half-hearted guerrilla warfare, evaded the Persian army, and lured them deeper into Scythian territory. Every time the Persians came close, the Scythians would switch routes and take them on another wild goose chase to nowhere. Over time, it became clear that the Scythians had no intention of fighting the Persians, and it was frustrating for Darius because there were no buildings within the Scythian territory to destroy. No cities to sack, and no spoils to forage as supplies for his troops. They were running out of resources. When they reached the Oris, modern-day Volga River, Darius set up camp and sent a strongly worded message to Idanthersis, king of the Scythians. What is this extraordinary behavior? Why do you keep on running away when you could do something different? For instance, if you think you have the ability to resist my power, then stop this aimless wandering. Stay in one place and fight. But if you recognize that you are weaker than me, you can still stop running. Come and discuss terms with me instead, acknowledging me as your master with gifts of earth and water. By earth and water, Darius meant that they should surrender. But Idanthersis responded that he had no plans to surrender, and he was also not interested in fighting either. And the reason was because he had no buildings, no cities, and no farmlands to lose. The only scenario where the Scythians would engage the Persians was if they found the graves of their ancestors and desecrated it. Where the graves were, no Persian could say for certain. Eventually, Darius came to accept the fact that the Scythians weren't going to fight. And they actually planned to wait till the Persians had run out of supplies so that they could win the battle easily. So Darius gave up on the war and began to make his way back to the bridge through Scythian territory. Meanwhile, the 60 days were up, and the Scythians had actually gone ahead of the Persians to speak to the Greeks at the bridge. They tried to convince the Greeks to destroy the bridge and free themselves from Persian rule. The Greeks deliberated what to do between themselves and eventually agreed to follow the advice of Hystaius of Miletus, who was against destroying the bridge. Instead, they pretended to destroy parts of the bridge that the Scythians could see, while encouraging them to return to finish off the Persians. The Scythians believed them and left. Fortunately for Darius and his men, the Scythians didn't find them before they reached the bridge. The Ionian Greeks were there to help Darius and the army cross the Danube to safety. But the Scythians never forgot the Greeks' trickery, and they never forgave them. They even had an insult for them. The Greeks make the worst and most cowardly free people in the world. But if they were to think of them as slaves, no master could hope to find more loyal and submissive captives. Before the King of Kings tried and failed to conquer Scythia, his conquest had brought parts of Libya under his control. Herodotus traveled to and saw these parts in 440 BC. He would have been 44 years old at the time. He wrote of the first Libyan groups to emerge from Egypt. They were called the Automachidae, and they followed Egyptian customs but wore Libyan attire. During their marriage ceremonies, their young women would parade themselves before their king, and the one the king liked the most slept with him that night. Their territory spanned from Egypt to a bay named Plinus. But if you continued westward, you'd find another Libyan tribe, the Machles, who lived around Lake Tritonus. And next to the Machles were the Aussi. They also lived around Lake Tritonus like the Machles, but the river Triton divided the two tribes. While the Machles grew their hair long at the back, the Aussi did the same, but at the front. The Aussi celebrated a festival to the glory of Athena once a year, where the unmarried young female tribe members would divide into two groups and fight one another with sticks and stones. This is how they fulfilled their ancestral duties to their native goddesses, the one the Greeks called Athena. They believed the women who died of their wounds after the fight were not true virgins. However, before they let them fight, the prettiest of the young women would be dressed in a Corinthian helmet and Greek armor, mounted on a chariot, and paraded around the Lake Tritonus. The Aussi led a very promiscuous lifestyle. Rather than forming couples or getting married, they had sex freely with whoever they wanted within the tribe. If a female tribe member got pregnant and gave birth to a child, all the male tribe members would gather on the baby's third month, and the man that the child resembled the most was considered the father. West of the Triton River and next to the Aussi was a Libyan tribe called the Maxes, who cultivated the land and owned houses. They shaved their hair off the left side of their heads but would let it grow long on the right side. They also smeared ochre on their bodies. Their land teemed with exotic wildlife. According to what the Libyans told Herodotus, there were enormous snakes, lions, elephants, bears, asps, donkeys with horns, dog-headed creatures, headless creatures with eyes in their chests, wild men, and wild women. Now, the successful conquest of Libya would not have been possible if the Persians didn't have a man named Megabazus. Megabazus was King Darius's most respected general. During the Persian king's fruitless Scythian campaign, it was Megabazus who led his vast army. After their retreat, after they crossed the bridge at Danube with the help of Hystaius of Miletus and his Ionian Greek comrades, Darius decided to return to Sardis, capital of Lydia. But before he returned, he left Megabazus a mandate. The general should stay back in Europe as commander-in-chief of an army of 80,000 men. The mission was simple: subjugate the Greek cities in Hellespont. In the months that followed, this is exactly what the general did. First, Megabazus conquered the brave Perithians. Then he marched through Thrace, bringing every settlement and tribe living there under the Persian king's rule. When Darius got to Sardis, he summoned Hystaius of Miletus and rewarded him for his role in keeping the bridge up at Danube. In the years after, Hystaius would become one of his most trusted advisors. After the victory over the Perithians, Megabazus dispatched a delegation of 7 prominent Persians to Macedonia. Their mission was to demand earth and water for King Darius. They wanted Macedonia to surrender. When they arrived at Macedonia, the king, Amyntas, granted them what they wanted and afterwards hosted a banquet for them. When the Persians were well fed and drunk, they scolded the Macedonian king for not offering them concubines and wives in accordance with Persian customs. Now, this was against Macedonian customs. Women weren't allowed to sit with men at the dinner tables. However, Amyntas agreed because he'd already offered earth and water to Darius. Women were provided for the drunk Persians, and they immediately began touching the women inappropriately. King Amyntas was maddened but refused to intervene. However, his son, Alexander, had other plans. He urged his father to go to bed and offered to attend to the Persians himself. Amyntas could sense Alexander had an ulterior motive, so he warned him against causing any trouble that would bring the wrath of Darius on Macedon. But Alexander ignored his father's advice and suggested letting the women bathe before offering them as gifts to the Persians. When they agreed, Alexander switched the women with beardless Macedonian men disguised in women's clothing and armed with daggers. This time, when the Persians attempted to touch them, the disguised Macedonians stabbed them to death. To avoid Darius's rage, Alexander got rid of their bodies and kept their death a secret. Meanwhile, Megabazus had grown suspicious of Hystaius. Darius was too fond of the Greek. The Persian king had given the Thracian land of Mycerinus to him as a gift, and now Hystaius had begun fortifying it. When Megabazus found out, he was furious. He protested to Darius, warning him about the potential threat Hystaius posed. "My lord," he said, "what have you done? You've allowed a Greek, and a cunning and clever Greek at that, to found a settlement in Thrace, where there is a limitless supply of timber for shipbuilding, where there are plenty of spars for oars. I think you should put an end to Hystaius' enterprise now if you want to avoid being embroiled in a war in your own territory." Darius saw reason in Megabazus' suspicions, and even though he trusted Hystaius deeply, he summoned the Greek tyrant to his court, ordering him to stay. Hystaius wasn't pleased with this arrangement, but he had no choice. Meanwhile, Hystaius' home Miletus was ruled by his son-in-law Aristogoras in his absence. Now, Aristogoras was a little ambitious. His ambition found opportunity when he was approached by some Naxians who were trying to reclaim their island, Naxos. Naxos was one of many islands on the South Aegean that weren't under Persian rule. Aristogoras saw an opportunity for conquest. So he approached Darius' half-brother Artaphernes, who was the head of their district. Artaphernes spoke to Darius, and Darius sent him the military resources he needed. But the conquest turned out to be a failure. After 3 months of fighting, Aristogoras accepted defeat. Aristogoras was scared his failure would enrage Darius. He was scared the Persian king would punish him for wasting the military resources he had sent for his little conquest. So, Aristogoras decided to protect himself by launching an Ionian revolt against the Persian king. Or did he? Herodotus claimed to know another version of the origins of the Ionian revolt. In this account, Hystaius, who had grown impatient with his new life in the king's court and longed to return home to rule his land, decided to send a trusted slave to Ionia with the word revolt tattooed on his scalp. When Aristagoras received the slave, he decided to act on the instructions of his father-in-law. Darius was enraged, but he didn't suspect Hystaius was behind the revolt. So when Hystaius came to the King of Kings, offering to return to Miletus to squash the revolt, Darius obliged. And so Hystaius made his way to his comrades. Meanwhile, Aristagoras began searching for allies that would help in his revolt against Darius and his Persian forces. He needed help from the strongest Greek state. He needed Sparta. When the Ionians revolted against Persia, Cleomenes was king of Sparta. But Cleomenes should never have been king. The only reason he even existed was because his father, the Spartan king Anaxandritus, was forced to take a second wife when his first wife couldn't bear him a child. Unfortunately for Anaxandritus, after he took that second wife, and after she had conceived Cleomenes, his first wife got pregnant also, and gave birth to a son, Dorius. After Dorius, his first wife got pregnant again with Leonidas, and immediately after that, Cleombrotus. 4 sons in total from his first wife, a woman everyone had thought was barren. Now, Dorius was the opposite of Cleomenes in character, intelligence, and strength. But none of that mattered because by law, he was the second son. So when their father Anaxandritus died, the throne went to Cleomenes, the firstborn son. Dorius refused this decision and refused to be ruled by Cleomenes. So he took some Spartans on an expedition to Libya, where he planned to find land and start his own colony of Spartans. On the way, Dorius got into a war that he had no business fighting. Unfortunately, he died on the battlefield, and Cleomenes continued his reign as king of Sparta. So when Aristagoras arrived in Sparta, he begged Cleomenes to liberate his people, the Ionians, from slavery. He described the Persians as wealthy people who had lots of gold, silver, bronze, clothes, animals, and slaves. He also tried to convince Cleomenes that conquering Persia would bring more riches than his local disputes. Cleomenes listened and asked for 2 days to think before his decision. 2 days later, Cleomenes asked Aristagoras how far the Ionian coast was from his palace. When Aristagoras mentioned a 3-month journey, Cleomenes immediately ordered him to leave. The war was not worth the distance. Aristagoras was thrown out of Sparta, so he turned to Athens. At the time, Athens was the second strongest Greek state, second only to Sparta. Aristagoras repeated the same things he had told the Spartan king to the Athenian assembly, but this time he was more desperate. He made so many promises that he eventually won the Athenians over, and they voted to send a fleet of 20 ships to help the Ionians in their revolt against the Persian army. As the Ionian revolt grew, so did her allies. Smyrna, Ephesus, and Byzantium all joined in attacking Persian garrisons in the region. In 498 BCE, a combined force of Ionian cities descended upon Sardis, capital of Lydia. It had been a stronghold of Persia ever since Cyrus deposed Croesus. The Persian forces in the city fought hard against the Ionian rebels but had to retreat to the city's central citadel, where Artaphernes and his Persian forces succeeded in holding off the Greek attackers. Eventually, Aristagoras and his Ionians realized they couldn't capture the city, so they chose to burn the city to the ground. And this was it. This was what pushed Darius to the edge, enraged him, and made him vow to crush Athens for aiding the revolt. This was what triggered Greco-Persian wars. The Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Plataea, and Salamis. This was the beginning of the war that Herodotus was born into. A war that would turn the tides against the Persians in favor of the Greeks. The Persian counterattack was swift, precise, utterly ruthless. Darius crushed and subdued all the Ionian cities that had participated in the revolt. Aristagoras fled. Hystaius would be killed and his head sent to the Persian king, who still refused to believe his beloved Greek had anything to do with the revolt. Miletus was captured, and the Ionian revolt came to an end. But Darius wasn't done. He wanted to punish Athens. So he sent his son-in-law, Mardonius, on a campaign to subdue the city. However, Mardonius faced a stunning failure as 300 ships from his fleet got destroyed in a storm off the coast of Mount Athos. This failure delayed the Persian invasion of Athens, and it was a blessing for them because the Athenians quickly took steps to defend themselves. Meanwhile, Persia began preparations for another invasion. Luckily for the Athenians, they had Miltiades. Miltiades was an Athenian general who had lived in Persia and was versed in Persian military tactics. He advised the Athenians to confront the Persians at Marathon because the terrain at Marathon was relatively flat. This would allow the Athenians to use their disciplined hoplite infantry effectively. The gods were on the side of the Athenians in this war. They had the approval of the Oracle of Delphi. They had Theseus, hero of Athens, on their side. The morale of the Athenians was at its peak. So with Miltiades leading from the army, the Athenians deployed approximately 10,000 hoplite soldiers to Marathon. When the Persian fleet landed at Marathon, the Athenians launched a surprise attack. Despite being outnumbered, the battle was fierce, and the Greeks successfully withstood the Persian archers and charged at the enemy, breaking their lines. When the dust settled, 6,400 Persians had fallen, and on the Athenian flank, only 192 men were killed. Ships, horses, supplies, transport vessels, Darius's rage knew no bounds as he fumed at the defeat he suffered at Marathon and prepared for yet another attempt on Athens. The 3 years that followed the Battle of Marathon saw the entire continent of Asia in turmoil as they raced to meet the heavy demands that Darius imposed on them. The King of Kings wanted revenge, but the situation was about to get more complex, because in the 4th year of his preparation, Egypt also revolted against the Persian Empire. Earth and water was not enough. Now, Darius wanted blood and fire. But before he could get his revenge, in the middle of his preparations and a few months after the Egyptian revolt, Darius the Great died. His son, Xerxes, son of Atassa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, took the throne of his father. Xerxes couldn't find a reason to continue his father's vendetta against the Greeks. Make no mistake, he squashed the Egyptian revolt, reducing them to a worse state of slavery than what they had experienced under Darius. But with the Greeks, he was hesitant. He was aware of the difficulties his father had faced, and the defeat at the Battle of Marathon was still fresh on everybody's mind. But Mardonius, his cousin and most trusted advisor, wanted the war. He tried and eventually succeeded in convincing Xerxes to continue Darius's war on the Greeks. Meanwhile, the Greeks formed a coalition of city-states. Everyone from the Spartans to the Athenians to the Thebans and Thespians, it was a united Greek front. They decided to stop the Persians from entering Greece by defending the pass of Thermopylae. It was a narrow coastal passage between the mountains and the sea. By forcing the Persians to wage war with them at this narrow pass, their vast army meant nothing. King Leonidas of Sparta was chosen to lead the Greek forces. 7,000 Greek hoplites and 300 Spartans under Leonidas defended that pass. Before the war began, Xerxes recognized how small the Greeks were and sent emissaries to Leonidas, giving them one last chance to surrender. More specifically, he asked them to surrender their weapons. But King Leonidas replied to the Persian king, "Come and take them." The Battle of Thermopylae lasted for 3 days. And for those 3 days, the Greeks held back the Persian advance with Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at the forefront of the offensive defense. Ephialtes was a local sheep herder who lived around Thermopylae and during the historical battle. He was Greek. Unfortunately, he was also a self-serving coward. The pass of Thermopylae was not the only way into Greece. There was a secret mountain path that led behind Greek lines, but Ephialtes revealed it to the Persians. He guided them through the path, hoping his act of betrayal would make Xerxes look kindly on him and reward him. Ephialtes got his reward, not from Xerxes, but from his fellow Greeks whom he betrayed. Much later, they hunted him down and killed him for his treachery. Using the mountain path, the Persians now surrounded the Greeks and the Spartans, flipping the odds of the battle in their favor. When Leonidas saw this, he ordered his Greek allies to retreat. Then King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans fought one last battle, fiercely till he and all 300 Spartans fell. The Greeks might have lost the Battle of Thermopylae, but their fierce resistance helped them buy valuable time to organize and prepare for future battles. And it also helped the morale of the Greeks, who had once again refused to offer earth and water to the King of Kings. While the Battle of Thermopylae was lost on land, the Greek fleet waxed with hope on the high seas. The Greek fleet at Artemisium comprised 127 Athenian ships, 40 Corinthian ships, 20 Megarian ships, and a handful of contributions from other city-states. A Spartan named Eurybiades led the fleet as supreme commander. Another hero on the seas was the Athenian Themistocles, who ensured that the Greeks remained united as tensions grew between the Athenians and other city-states. It also appeared like the gods were on the side of the Athenians, because when the vast Persian fleet tried to surround and destroy the Athenian fleet, a storm raged and destroyed them instead. 200 Persian ships perished. However, this did not mean the Persians could be stopped. They still outnumbered the Greek on the sea. Themistocles knew that he could only hold off the Persians for so long. He knew that a Persian invasion was inevitable. He knew it was only a matter of time before the Persians raided Athens. And if that happened, if Xerxes gave Darius his revenge by spilling Athenian blood, then the spirits of the Greek would be defeated, and battles would be lost before they began. So he made a difficult decision. Themistocles evacuated every living thing from Athens. He emptied out the city and moved the citizens to the island of Salamis, far away from the conflict. The Athenians would fight without fear when their families were safe. 5 months after the Battle of Thermopylae, the Greeks found themselves once again in the heat of another battle. The odds were against them. The Persian fleet had such a numerical advantage over the Greeks, the war looked over before it even began. But Themistocles had a strategy to level the playing field. Like always, he had to play to Greek advantage. And to do that, he planned to use the narrow waters of Salamis Straits to diminish the numerical strength of the Persian navy. The Persian ships were large and difficult to maneuver. The Greek ships, on the other hand, were the opposite, much smaller, much more nimble. They were called triremes. In battle, Themistocles and the Greek fleet feigned a retreat and lured the Persian ships into the narrow straits. In the strait, and as predicted, the Persian ships were trapped and disorganized. They couldn't use their numerical superiority to their advantage. So the Greeks exploited this chaos and cut through them like a hot dagger through cheese. The result was a devastating defeat for the Persian navy. The Greek could see their victory peaking above the horizon, but the war was still far from over. After the defeat at Salamis, Xerxes returned to Persia and left Mardonius in command of the remaining forces in Greece. General Mardonius moved south to occupy Athens. Thanks to Themistocles' foresight, the city had already been deserted, and the Athenian population had taken refuge on the nearby island of Salamis. But the Greek were not naive. They knew as long as the Persians continued to stay on their continent, they remained a serious threat to Greek freedom. The war wasn't over. So they formed new and stronger alliances between city-states. Sparta took the lead of this alliance, and Pausanias, a Spartan general, was appointed as the overall commander of the Greek forces. Winter was approaching. On the Persian front, General Mardonius knew that a winter campaign against the Greek forces on their land would be disastrous. So he left Athens, moved to Thebes, and tried to entice the Greek city-states into breaking their alliance. At this time, the Thebans had already abandoned the Greek cause and sided with the Persians. Why? To spite the Athenians. They hated them that much. However, they would pay dearly for it much later. In the meantime, the allied Greek army rejected Mardonius' offer and chose to march towards Plataea while their fleet sailed to Mycale to confront the Persians. One war, two battlefronts, on land and on sea. The objective? Incredibly simple. Expel the Persian forces from all of Greece. At Plataea, the Greeks employed a defensive strategy. They used its high ground for their hoplite phalanx formation. Then they built stake walls around their camp. Meanwhile, Mardonius had journeyed to Plataea with his army, ready for what was about to become a decisive battle. Mardonius began the attack with his archers and cavalry, trying to undermine their mobility while breaking through their defensive lines. But the Greeks' tightly packed formation of soldiers with overlapping shields and protruding spears ensured that the Persian arrows were useless, and their cavalry ineffective. At first, it seemed like the battle would go on forever. Then the tables turned on the Persian army. A Spartan named Erimnestus murdered Mardonius in the heat of battle. The effect of their general's death was immediate and destabilizing. The Persian forces were demoralized, and the Greeks exploited their confusion for a brutal counterattack. As the Persians retreated, the Greeks pursued them relentlessly, killing as many as they could. On the fields of Plataea, the Greeks had won the battle. Meanwhile, at sea, Pausanias and his Greek fleet waged a bitter war against the Persians. At first, the Persian resistance was effective, but when an Athenian fleet, led by Leotychides, arrived to join the battle, the Greeks turned the tides against the Persians. The Persian ships that weren't destroyed completely fled in retreat, back to Sardis and Lydia. The Persian naval power was so severely diminished that it spelt the end of the Persian threat on mainland Greece, and the beginning of an independence that the Greeks had fought with their soul, their spirit, blood, and sweat. The year was 479 BC, and the historian Herodotus was just 5 years old at the time. He would have heard the impossible tales of glory, and he would have wondered how and why. While he didn't write about it in his histories, Xerxes is believed to have met a violent end at the hands of assassins in 465 BC when Herodotus was 19. And as Herodotus grew older, traveled around the world, and recorded the stories, he would have his own moment against tyranny. The year was 454 BCE. Herodotus was either at the end or the latter end of his travels. The stories, the people, the cultures, and the geography of the diverse people he had traveled allowed for a detailed map to be constructed. Herodotus would have been 30 years at this time, somewhere in the midst of his many travels. At the time, Lygdamis was the terrible tyrant of Halicarnassus, the same tyrant that had killed Herodotus' uncle, squashing an uprising that saw Herodotus and his family exiled from their home. In 454 BCE, there was another uprising. This time, Herodotus joined the rebellion, bringing a permanent end to Lygdamis' tyranny. Around 450 BCE, and at the age of 34, Herodotus joined a group establishing a colony at Thurii, a Greek city in southern Italy. He spent his later years in Thurii working on his histories. Historians believe he also spent some time in Athens. If you existed during his time, you would have heard it from the mouth of the man himself as you stood in the midst of a Greek crowd in awe. It's also possible that if you lived in Olympia during the time Herodotus visited, you could have rubbed shoulders with the father of a young boy named Thucydides. Historians say that as Herodotus recited his work, Thucydides burst into tears, and Herodotus told the boy's father quite prophetically, "Your son's soul yearns for knowledge." Thucydides would grow up to become one of the most important historians of antiquity, whose rigorous and systematic approach was heavily inspired by the methodology and style of Herodotus. After Thucydides, thousands of historians have followed in his footsteps, looking up to Herodotus as the first true historian. Sometime between 425 and 413 BCE, Herodotus died, leaving behind a legacy that has endured beyond 2 millennia to this very moment.